You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. In an operating room in Los Angeles, California, an optic surgeon stood over his patient, a 9-year-old girl. He lifted his pair of specialized forceps, which are kind of like tweezers, and he opened up the 2 blades, sliding them carefully into either corner of her eye socket. Then he gently grabbed on to her eyeball with these forceps, and slowly he pulled her eyeball out of its socket until he heard the pop of air and the squish of soft tissue, which told him the eye was now fully dislodged from the socket. Now only the thick optic nerve still attached the eyeball to the girl's skull. The surgeon turned the eye over until he was looking at the back of it, and there he saw a hard, black mass on the inner part of the eyeball. He touched the mass gently. It was so thick that for a moment, the doctor wasn't sure how he was going to remove it. He needed to use enough force to get it off his patient's eye, but it would be very easy to overdo it and cause serious damage. So he had to proceed with extreme caution. With an even smaller set of forceps, the surgeon pinched the black mass and slowly began to tease it off the little girl's eye. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm MrBallen, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape: our own bodies. If you like today's story, please tell the follow button you'll teach them how to play golf, and immediately after their first tee, call the marshal and complain they are playing too slowly. This episode is called Jade's Eye. In March of 2013, 9-year-old Jade Howe sat in the nurse's office at her elementary school in Kona, Hawaii. It was the annual vision screening at her school, and Jade was busy telling the visiting optometrist all about the cupcake her mom packed her for lunch and how excited she was for hula dancing class after school. The optometrist laughed and asked Jade to sit up straight so he could examine her. Jade straightened her back and smiled as the optometrist dimmed the lights and then shined a flashlight into her left eye. Right away, Jade flinched. The light made her head hurt a little, but then her eyes adjusted. She was used to eye exams. She had worn glasses for most of her life, so she knew what to expect. Normally, she would just read charts on the wall while the optometrist gave her different lenses to try. But today was different. She'd had a headache off and on all morning, and her vision felt blurred, like everything was fuzzy around the edges. So it was harder than usual for her to read all those charts. The optometrist clicked his tongue a few times like he was thinking through a problem, and Jade got the feeling that something might be wrong. Just as Jade was about to ask if everything was okay, the optometrist handed her a black plastic spatula and told her to use it to cover up her right eye. Then the doctor held up a sheet of paper with rows of letters on it and asked her to read the lines aloud using just her left eye. But when Jade put that spatula over her right eye, her vision from her left eye became so blurred that she could barely see anything at all. She lowered the spatula and inspected it as if the spatula was to blame. But when she saw no issue with the spatula, she just put it right back over her right eye, but again, she could barely see out of her left eye. She asked the optometrist what happened to her left eye, but the optometrist just scribbled on a pink notepad and ripped off the paper, and he handed it to Jade and told her to give it to her parents the moment she got home from school. That afternoon, when school let out, Jade ran to her mother, Ho Ola'i Berman, who was standing on the sidewalk waiting for her. Jade immediately handed her mother the optometrist's report and watched a worried look come over her face as she read it. Jade asked her mom if something was wrong with her eyes, but her mom just smiled and told her not to worry. They'd schedule an appointment with the optometrist when they got home. Jade very likely just needed new glasses. Jade felt very relieved and just nodded, and then she shifted her focus and just began digging through her backpack for her lunchbox. She had saved a fruit roll-up for the walk home. Usually, Jade and her mother would stop at a park near their house to play and unwind after school, but today, when they got to that park, Jade didn't really feel like playing. She still had a headache and she could barely see out of her left eye, so she ended up just sitting in the sandbox eating her snack. Jade was absent-mindedly digging in the sand when a dog wandered over to say hello. She had seen this dog before. It was a stray, and it was a little scraggly looking, but it was always friendly, and Jade knew it loved belly rubs. And so after a few minutes of playing, the dog wandered off to a garbage can to look for food, and then Jade's mom came over and sat down beside Jade and asked her how she was feeling. Jade didn't answer. She just leaned over and put her aching head in her mother's lap. She was relieved when she heard her mom say that it was time to go home. A few days later, Jade's mother, Ho'ola'i, sat in the corner of an optometrist's office watching him finish up Jade's eye exam. The optometrist switched off the lights and smiled at Jade, and then said he'd actually like to take some x-rays. Jade's mom was a little surprised, but agreed to any extra cost if it helped her daughter see. The optometrist took the x-rays right there in his office, and 15 minutes later, they all gathered around his computer screen, looking at the enlarged images of Jade's left eye. To Jade and her mother, the image they were looking at just kind of looked like a big grape with veins running through it. But the optometrist immediately pointed at a small black mass located on the retina at the back of Jade's left eye. He was certain that this black mass was causing Jade's vision loss. The retina's job is to focus the eye, and so the mass was clearly getting in the way. But he wasn't sure what the mass was. The best thing to do was treat it like an infection and start Jade on antibiotics. Then they could see if that cleared it up and go from there. On the car ride home, Jade complained that her headache was back. Her mom sighed and said that it sounded like something only ice cream could fix. Jade smiled and started bouncing with excitement in her seat. Ho'ola'i laughed as she started driving towards the nearest ice cream shop, convinced that her daughter would feel better in a few days. But after a week, Jade was not feeling any better. Her head still hurt and she could barely see out of her left eye. So her mom called the optometrist, who told her it was time for them to go see a doctor who has a specialty in these types of issues. The next morning, Jade's mom sat beside her dad, Jack, in the eye specialist's office. Jade curled up on her father's lap, playing a game on his phone while they waited for test results and x-rays. A moment later, a stout man in a lab coat walked into the office and sat on a stool opposite Jade and her parents. He pulled the stool closer to his desk, pulling Jade's x-rays up on his computer screen and flipping through a clipboard on his desk. He told Jade's parents that the antibiotics had not cleared up the black mass on Jade's eye. Then he pointed to the dark spot on Jade's x-ray. The doctor explained that the mass behind Jade's eye appeared to be inflamed, and when he compared the x-ray taken that morning to the x-ray taken last week, the mass really seemed to be growing bigger, which meant that Jade's sight loss would likely only get worse. Her headaches might become more severe too, and if the mass got too swollen, Jade could lose all sight in that eye. Jade's mom suddenly felt a lump in her throat as she asked the doctor what could be done. The doctor looked over at Jade with a hint of pity on his face, and then he said that he'd like to try injecting steroids directly into the mass, which would hopefully reduce the swelling and clear up the mass completely. It was a scary sounding procedure, he said, but it would be done with anesthesia and it would only take a minute. And once it was over, Jade really should be cured. Jade would have this procedure done, but 2 days later, when Jade and her mother, Ho'ola'i, returned for a follow-up appointment, the specialist walked into the examination room with a glum expression on his face, and he told them that the injection had not worked. And worse than that, he said he was out of ideas. They were going to have to find a new doctor. And so over the next few weeks, Jade and her mother visited 3 other eye specialists, but none of them could figure out what was causing this black mass on Jade's left eye either. Jade's mother was really frustrated and very upset. She remembered what the first specialist had said about her daughter potentially losing all the sight in her eye, and so now she felt like if they didn't find an answer soon, it would just be too late. By the time Jade and her mother found themselves waiting anxiously in the exam room of the most experienced eye doctors on the island, it had been almost 3 months since Jade's eye began to hurt, and both Jade and Ho'ola'i were fighting a growing feeling of hopelessness. Jade's mom would never give up on her daughter, but she was tired and scared. The door finally opened, and a tall man with short black hair and a prominent chin strode inside. His name was Dr. Eugene Ng, and he was a retina surgeon. He squatted down in front of Jade and asked her gently if he could look at her eyes. Jade smiled and nodded and let go of her mother's hand. Her mother felt relief rise in her chest. She liked Dr. Ng immediately, and it was clear Jade did too. But as Dr. Ng shined a flashlight into Jade's eyes and conducted a few quick tests, Jade's mother tried to tamp down her optimism. This was the same thing every other doctor had done, and when Dr. Ng clicked off his flashlight and stood up, she braced herself to hear him say, "Well, there's nothing we can do. Go find another doctor." But, unlike all the other eye specialists, Dr. Ng said he was fairly certain he knew what was wrong with her eye. Jade's mother could barely believe this. She smiled and let herself hope, just for a second, that finally her daughter would get the help she needed. But then she realized that Dr. Ng was not smiling back at her. Instead, he looked almost grim as he told her that while he could diagnose Jade's problem, nobody in all of Hawaii had the expertise to actually fix it. Jade needed immediate medical attention that was not available on the islands, so she would have to be flown to the mainland of the United States as soon as possible. A week later, Jade sat with her mother in the back of an Uber that was driving them from the Los Angeles International Airport to their hotel. Jade watched the other cars on the highway blur past and noticed how beige and concrete everything looked in Southern California compared to the lush green of Hawaii. Jade was really missing her father. Jack had had to stay home in Hawaii to work, and he was also going to miss Jade's birthday, which was in 2 days. Jade dreaded the idea of turning 10 without her father around, and she also dreaded seeing another specialist that afternoon. Even though her left eye was now completely blurry and her headaches had only been getting worse, Jade was scared of going to see another doctor. She was afraid that whatever treatment they would give her would be more painful and more uncomfortable than what she was already experiencing. But Jade tried to push her worry from her mind. After all, she was in the city where all her favorite movies were made. Her mom had even promised her that they could go do some sightseeing when they weren't at the doctor's office. And so Jade decided she was just going to have fun on this trip no matter what. That afternoon, Jade sat in another examination chair, this time at the Children's Retina Institute in Los Angeles. A doctor with red hair and a neatly trimmed beard was drawing blood samples from Jade's arm, while Jade told him all about the last time she'd been poked with a needle and how much it had hurt. The doctor's name was Dr. Khaled Tawanzi, and Jade's mother had told Jade that he was actually the one who started this institute. Jade watched the blood flow from her arm down through a plastic tube and into small vials. It didn't hurt at all, and Jade actually found it fascinating to watch. She asked Dr. Tawanzi what he was going to do with her blood, and he smiled at her. He explained that he'd send her blood to a very special laboratory where scientists would run all kinds of tests. Then, in a day or two, they'd know for sure if Dr. Ng was right about what was causing the blindness in her left eye. Jade imagined an all-white laboratory full of shiny machines and scientists in blue scrubs. She'd seen something like that in a movie once. It made her feel safe, like the best doctors in Los Angeles would be working to save her vision. Dr. Tawanzi told Jade that in the meantime, her very important assignment was to have as much fun in Los Angeles as possible. Jade smiled as her mom assured him that they had plenty of plans for that. 2 days later, Jade peered over the side of a tour trolley, watching a shark's fin move through a man-made pool set to the iconic Jaws movie soundtrack. It was her 10th birthday, and her mother had taken her to Universal Studios Hollywood. Just as the music reached a crescendo, an animatronic shark came leaping out of the water. Jade leaped back from the edge of the trolley, and then she laughed and clapped with the rest of the tour group. By the time Jade and her mother got off the trolley a few minutes later, Jade felt better than she had in a long time. For just a moment, she had forgotten all about her troubles. She decided it was birthday magic. As she led her mother away from the studios tour, Jade heard her mother's cell phone ring. She turned to look at her mom, and Ho'ola'i dug through her purse, pulled out her phone. She looked at the caller ID and asked Jade to wait a minute. It was Dr. Tawanzi calling. Jade sat down on a nearby green plastic bench while her mom paced and listened. Jade watched as the smile on her mother's face faded. Jade's stomach lurched. She knew that whatever news her mother was receiving, it could not be good. Jade swung her legs nervously as her mother hung up with the doctor and then made a second phone call, which was much shorter. And when her mother turned around, Jade could tell she was extremely upset. Ho'ola'i strode over and sat on the bench next to her daughter. Jade held her breath as her mom explained what the doctor had told her. Jade needed surgery. Jade felt tears well up in her eyes as she asked her mother if the surgery would actually save her eyesight. Her mom frowned and struggled to find the right words. Finally, she explained that they didn't know if this procedure could actually save her eyesight. But without this surgery, it was fairly likely that she could lose her entire left eye. If that happened, she would have to have a glass eye instead. Jade tried to picture the doctor cutting out her eye and what it would feel like with a glass ball in her eye socket. The very thought of it sent tears running down her face, and she turned to her mom and sobbed into her chest. The next morning, Jade's mother stood next to Jade's gurney at the Children's Retina Institute. Jade looked frightened and kept looking around for her father, who had gotten on the first plane available to come join them. Jack was supposed to have landed more than an hour ago, and Jade's mother was worried he would miss the surgery. Ho'ola'i squeezed her daughter's hand as Dr. Tawanzi propped open the double doors that led to the operating room. He asked Jade if she was ready, and her mother beamed proudly as Jade nodded her head bravely. Then they heard a commotion down the hall. They all turned to see Jade's dad, Jack, burst into the hallway and run toward the gurney. When Jack reached them, he leaned down and planted a big kiss on Jade's forehead. He whispered in Jade's ear happy birthday and that he loved her. Finally, a nurse said it was time to take Jade into surgery, and so Ho'ola'i and Jack both blew kisses at their daughter as she was rolled into the operating room. The parents held each other as they watched the doors swing closed. It all felt so unfair. Their daughter was barely 10 years old, and she might lose her eye. And now, all they could do was wait and hope. In the operating room, Dr. Tawanzi waited until Jade was completely asleep before using a speculum, which is like a small vice grip, to pry open her left eyelid. Once her eyelid was propped open, Dr. Tawanzi began the careful process of removing Jade's eye completely from its socket so that only the optical nerve was connecting it to her body. Once Dr. Tawanzi had freed Jade's eyeball from its socket, he held it up and turned it around until he was looking at the back. He had seen scans of the mass on Jade's eye, but he was still shocked by how it looked in person. It was a thick, dark mass, and it was caked on so hard it felt like a rock. Dr. Tawanzi could tell it was going to be extremely difficult to remove it without permanently injuring Jade's eye, because the doctor knew there was a risk that this mass was not just on Jade's eye, it might be embedded inside of Jade's eye. And if that was the case, Jade would very likely lose her eye entirely no matter what Dr. Tawanzi did. But Dr. Tawanzi would not know how bad this was until he attempted to remove it. It took Dr. Tawanzi nearly 3 hours to remove this foreign mass from Jade's eyeball, slowly pulling it off one tiny piece at a time. It almost felt like he was tearing cardboard with each pull. But finally, with one last gentle pull, the last of the black lump dislodged. Dr. Tawanzi placed it all on a dish, and a nurse whisked it away for testing. Then he lifted Jade's eyeball with his forceps and slid it back into the socket, hoping it could be saved. The first thing Jade saw when she woke up was her parents' smiling faces. However, she only saw them through her right eye. A protective patch was covering her left eye following the surgery. Jade felt groggy, but she was so relieved to see her parents, especially her dad, who told her she looked so cool, like a pirate. But then Jade began to panic as she touched her patch and wondered if she still even had an eye behind it. Was there a glass eyeball now? But her mom took Jade's hand and told her, don't worry, she still had her eye. Dr. Tawanzi was able to save it. Jade smiled huge with relief. Her mom was crying and told Jade what a great job she did. A few moments after that, Dr. Tawanzi walked into the recovery room. Jade and her family grinned and thanked him for his help. But Dr. Tawanzi said they were not out of the woods yet. He told Jade and her parents that Dr. Ng had been right about his diagnosis. Jade's condition was much more dangerous than anything doctors in Hawaii could treat, and the surgery was not a guaranteed solution. Because Jade's eyeball had been invaded by living creatures. The creatures, he said, were parasites called Toxocara, otherwise known as roundworm. Dr. Tawanzi explained that usually Toxocara is spread through dog feces. He asked if Jade had a pet dog at home. Jade said no, but then she told Dr. Tawanzi about the stray dog that she sometimes played with at the local park. Dr. Tawanzi nodded and said that it was very possible to pick up Toxocara at a park frequented by stray dogs, or even just by pets and their owners. All it would take for Jade to get this infection would be for her to touch a tiny bit of dirt with dog feces on it, and then touch her mouth. Toxocara is not rare. In fact, they are one of the most common parasites in the world. About 5% of American adults have antibodies in them that show they have been exposed at some point in their lives to Toxocara. But most people who ingest Toxocara eggs don't get a single symptom and never even know the parasite was inside of them at all. Typically, the body forms a hard shell around the parasite and expels through the intestines. But in some cases, the body is too slow to react, and the parasites migrate through the body and end up in organs like the liver, kidneys, and sometimes even the eyes. And that's what had happened to Jade. She had developed a very rare condition called ocular toxocariasis. In ocular toxocariasis, the body does finally form that protective shell around the parasites, but only after the parasites have attached themselves to the eye. That's why the mass on the back of Jade's eye was so hard. Her body was trying to protect her, just a little too late. Jade got lucky. Her body's response had come in time to stop the parasites before they completely destroyed her eye. And Dr. Tawanzi was pretty sure he managed to remove every last parasite from her body. Still, he told Jade and her parents that she would have to be watched very closely in the days ahead to make sure he had not missed any. Most of Dr. Tawanzi's explanation went way over Jade's head, but she grimaced at the disgusting thought of accidentally eating dog poop, and Dr. Tawanzi actually laughed a little bit when he saw Jade's face. He told her it's much more common than you think. Just make sure you always wash your hands after the playground and you'll be okay. Jade grinned as a wave of relief washed over her. She was ready to be done with doctor's offices and dog poop. A few days later, the family all flew back home to Hawaii. Jade's eyesight in her left eye would come back. However, it really never fully recovered. But other than her vision, she would be okay. Jade would go on to be a cheerleader for her high school, and she would also continue to dance hula. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story, and also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Aaron Lan. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Andre Plus. Coordinating producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Teja Palakonda. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballen Studios, our head of production is Zach Levitt. Script editing is by Scott Allen and Evan Allen. Our coordinating producer is Matub Zair. Executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballen, and Nick Witters. For Wondery, our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Senior producers are Loredana Palavoda and Dave Schilling. Senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr. Our executive producers are Aaron O'Flaherty and Marshall Louie for Wondery. You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. In the spring of 1914, a cotton farmer in Milledgeville, Georgia, sat down inside of his house for lunch. He was glad to be out of the sweltering heat outside, which lately had been causing him a bunch of trouble. A few weeks ago, he'd gotten an unusually bad sunburn, which had only grown worse and turned into a very itchy rash. Scratching the rash felt like his skin was on fire. So he was glad to distract himself with a hearty meal of cornmeal cooked with bacon and drizzled in molasses. But when the farmer was done eating, he suddenly felt this wave of fatigue sweep over him, and his tongue suddenly felt prickly, making it seem swollen and strange inside of his mouth. His wife came to his side and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, but the farmer jolted and winced in pain. Before he could stop her, she pulled down his collar to have a look at his skin, and she gasped. His entire neck was ringed with a scaly rash. She told him he needed medical attention right now. The doctor might put him in the hospital, and then who would take care of the farm? But his wife insisted. She promised she could handle things at the farm while he was gone. The farmer nodded. He knew she was right. So he struggled to his feet and then hobbled over to their dresser and packed a small bag of clothes. Then he hugged his wife goodbye and hiked down the road towards the nearest healthcare provider, the Georgia State Sanitarium for the Insane. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm MrBallen, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please go to the Follow Button's college graduation, and right when they're about to receive their diploma, stand up and make a scene where you scream out that they cheated on all of their exams. This episode is called Scourge of the South. On a hot, muggy morning in June of 1914, a 40-year-old physician named Joseph G. Goldberger stepped down from his horse-drawn carriage right out in front of a palatial brick building in rural Georgia. He was impressed, but also confused by the grandiose architecture. It looked more like a state capitol than what it really was, a mental hospital. The doctor shielded his eyes from the sun and loosened his collar and fanned his face with a stack of papers as sweat poured down his body. He had traveled all over the world in his work for the United States Public Health Service, but he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt heat this oppressive. He hoped that once he got inside, it would be a bit cooler. So Dr. Goldberger paid the carriage driver, grabbed his bags, and then marched right up the steps into the front office of the Georgia State Sanitarium for the Insane. The doctor was there on direct orders from the United States Surgeon General to investigate a skin disease called pellagra that was ravaging the American South. The word pellagra was Italian for rough or dry skin, but that name totally understates the danger of this condition. People sometimes called pellagra the disease of the 4 Ds, referring to how it progresses: dermatitis, then diarrhea, then dementia, and then finally death. Until the past decade, there had rarely been a case of pellagra in the United States, but in recent years, it had arrived with a vengeance. And now it was an epidemic. In the American South alone, there were at least 100,000 confirmed cases of pellagra. The U.S. Public Health Service had only been studying pellagra for about 5 years, so they hadn't been able to determine its cause yet, but the leading theory was that it was spread by a type of black fly that feeds on blood. And if that was true, Dr. Goldberger knew he was taking a huge risk coming here. He could get pellagra too. But Dr. Goldberger had been taking risks ever since he was a child, when his family emigrated from Hungary to New York without a cent to their name. And now he was one of the most distinguished physicians in the U.S. Public Health Service, and he had investigated outbreaks of yellow fever, typhus, dengue fever, Schamberg's disease, and typhoid fever, just to name a few. Nearly every time, he'd caught the disease he was fighting. But Dr. Goldberger was a man on a mission. He had to know why there was such a concentration of pellagra cases at places where people lived in large groups, like old age homes, prisons, orphanages, and mental asylums. He decided to start his research at this sanitarium in Georgia, one of the largest mental hospitals in the world with over 3,000 patients, many of which had pellagra. Once the doctor entered the vaulted 4-story entrance hall, he shook hands with the head nurse and explained his plan. He wanted to interview the most advanced pellagra patients first, since they had the most symptoms to study. The nurse led Dr. Goldberger out of the main building, around a fountain, and down a tree-lined road to a 3-story building. She explained that the sanitarium was segregated by gender and race. She was taking him to where the white male patients were kept. They were some of their worst pellagra cases. The doctor followed as she led the way up some stairs and then down a long hallway lined with doors. Moans and babbling voices echoed off the stone walls. Dr. Goldberger glanced through the circular windows on each door as they passed. Patients were crowded several to a room, often with widely differing conditions. from alcoholics to senile old men to people suffering violent psychotic episodes. Some of the patients were there voluntarily, but others were basically prisoners who had been brought against their will. Dr. Goldberger had seen plenty of human suffering throughout his career, but the misery of these men was still hard to witness. Eventually, they stopped at a heavy wooden door. The nurse removed a key from her ring, then unlocked the door and held it open for the doctor. Inside the cramped, low-ceiling room, a tired-looking man sat on a narrow cot. The nurse said he was a local cotton farmer named Henry, and he had one of the worst cases of pellagra at the hospital. Dr. Goldberger flinched at the sharp smell of sweat and body odor inside of the room, and also at the farmer's appearance. His appearance reminded the doctor of medical photos he'd seen of leper colonies in India. The farmer's neck, hands, forearms, and feet were crusted over in this splotchy black mass. As the doctor stepped closer, he could see that the blackness was caused by scabbed-over blood from popped sores. The room was hot and stuffy. The only ventilation was a small window on the far wall. If pellagra was contagious, this was a terrible place to visit an infected patient. But Dr. Goldberger was determined to get to the bottom of this, so he braced himself for the danger ahead and then confidently walked over to the farmer and shook the man's hand. Dr. Goldberger said hello to Henry and asked to hear his story. Henry nodded and then told the doctor that he had admitted himself to the sanitarium a few months ago. At first, Henry thought the rash on his body was just a sunburn, but the rash had continued to spread even when he was out of the sun, and then when the strange, prickly feeling spread to his mouth, he realized this had to be something worse than just a sunburn. He was worried about his wife and his kids catching whatever he had, so he had come here. And this wasn't all. Henry now suffered from near constant diarrhea. He couldn't sleep much or taste food, and his motor skills were deteriorating. He sighed and said he knew there wasn't anything to be done. The staff had told him that since the cause of pellagra still was not known, that meant there weren't any proven treatments. There was very little they could do to help him. Dr. Goldberger asked Henry to stand up so he could examine him. But when the farmer tried to get up, his legs were so shaky he had to immediately sit back down. Dr. Goldberger was shocked to see firsthand what this disease could do to the human body in just a few months. Henry slowly raised his head to look at the doctor. His eyes had trouble focusing, and he spoke in a cracked voice as he explained his situation. His wife was too busy with their kids to actually manage the farm, and so every day Henry was here at the sanitarium was another day they were not able to tend to their crops. And if he was gone much longer, they would lose everything. Dr. Goldberger stared back at Henry and promised him that he would not stop until he discovered what caused his illness. After leaving Henry's room, Dr. Goldberger followed the nurse on a tour of the rest of the sanitarium. He interviewed dozens of men and women of different ages and races. Each case was tragic in its own way. Pellagra was relentless once it took hold. Seeing children covered in painful sores broke Dr. Goldberger's heart. It seemed like there was nothing anybody could do to help them. But what puzzled Dr. Goldberger the most was just how erratic this disease was. It didn't make sense to him why the pellagra hadn't spread further. In these hot, unventilated buildings, he would have thought entire wards would have caught it by now if it was contagious, but only a fraction of the residents were sick. That night, as Dr. Goldberger went over his notes in his room, he realized that the next step was to interview the staff, all 293 of them. The following morning, Dr. Goldberger was given a vacant office to conduct his interviews. He made sure the survey he would give each staff member was very thorough. How long each person had worked at the sanitarium, which ward they were stationed in, what their interactions had been with every patient, as well as everything about their daily routine. One after another, the staff came in, introduced themselves, and patiently answered every question, and all of them were smiling and very helpful. And for some reason, something just didn't seem right to Dr. Goldberger. An hour into the process, it struck him. None of the staff were sick in the slightest. These were people who worked in buildings full of patients with pellagra, yet none of them showed even a single symptom of having caught the disease. This made Dr. Goldberger wonder, was pellagra really contagious? The prevailing medical theory was that pellagra was an infectious bacteria carried by insects that spread the disease with their bites, If that theory was right, then why were these insects only infecting patients and not the staff? Black flies looking for blood will bite anyone. Dr. Goldberger suspected that something else besides black flies must be causing this disease. In fact, he wondered if pellagra was really an infectious disease at all. He almost laughed out loud with relief. This might be the first time in his career of fighting epidemics that he himself did not get sick. And so if this theory Dr. Goldberger was thinking about was correct, then it was totally useless to make people sick with pellagra stay in isolation. The much more important task was trying to figure out what was causing the pellagra in all these people. Thankfully, the hospital had a telephone. Once Dr. Goldberger wrapped up his interviews with the staff, he called the Surgeon General and received permission to continue his investigation. Dr. Goldberger wanted to inspect another hotbed of pellagra outbreaks, this time at an orphanage in Jackson, Mississippi. And as Dr. Goldberger headed to his room to pack, one of the nurses pulled him aside. She said she had bad news. Henry, the local cotton farmer, had just been found dead inside of his room. Dr. Goldberger shook his head. He wondered how many more people like Henry would die before he could figure out what was causing this horrible disease. Two days later, Dr. Goldberger hurried toward the entrance of the Methodist Orphan Asylum in Jackson, Mississippi, hoping to get out of the blinding sun. He hadn't thought it possible, but somehow it felt even hotter here than in Georgia. And the stakes were a lot higher here, too. Here, the people suffering were children. Children who had no families to comfort them. The orphanage looked far more welcoming than the imposing sanitarium. It reminded Dr. Goldberger of a small country church, with an arched entryway and 2 bell towers above. Inside, the matron who ran the orphanage introduced herself and showed the doctor to his guest quarters in the visitor's wing. After putting away his things, he followed her on a tour of the building. Despite the building's friendly exterior, Dr. Goldberger realized the place needed serious maintenance. As the matron showed him around, he could see cracks in the ceiling, and the bathrooms smelled swampy, like they'd recently flooded or had plumbing problems. The staff was also quite small compared to the number of kids they were caring for, but the kids were relatively well behaved and happy. The doctor poked his head in one of the dormitories and noticed the majority of the beds were made. When they approached the hospital ward, the matron warned Dr. Goldberger to brace himself for a very unpleasant sight. The ward was a long, low room lined with narrow beds, almost like an army barracks. Fully 1/3 of the orphanage, 68 kids, were isolated here because they all had signs of pellagra. In some kids, the pellagra rash had spread up their neck and onto their face. As Dr. Goldberger followed the matron through the room, a particularly sad-looking girl who looked to be about 8 years old caught his eye. She was sitting cross-legged on her bed holding a book. Dr. Goldberger noticed stripes of red sores creeping out beneath the cuffs of her sleeves. The doctor sat down next to her and asked how she was feeling. The girl said she couldn't sleep anymore because her body constantly itched all over, and whenever she scratched it, her skin burned like it was on fire. She peeled back the collar of her shirt to show him. Her neck was ringed in a dark, scaly rash. Dr. Goldberger patted her hands and told her to stay strong. He was going to do everything he could to help her. She nodded, but she did not seem convinced. As Dr. Goldberger looked around the ward, he realized that nearly all of the kids were within a couple of years of this little girl's age. He saw almost no preschoolers or teenagers, even though the orphanage provided homes for kids from birth to age 18. Dr. Goldberger was puzzled, but he kept his thoughts to himself. Dr. Goldberger stood up and followed the matron outside to where a group of older children were helping build a storage shed. The matron explained to the doctor that that was today's chore. As Dr. Goldberger watched these teenagers sawing and hammering planks of wood out in the sun, he was struck by the contrast between them and all the younger children inside the hospital ward. These older kids looked so happy and healthy, and none had even the faintest sign of pellagra. The doctor jotted down some observations in his notebook and then followed the matron to their final stop, the nursery. Inside, it was loud and crowded, with infants and small children scattered all about. Some were playing with blocks and old weathered toys, while others napped on cots. The room felt hot and chaotic, but as Dr. Goldberger studied these kids, he couldn't see any signs of sickness. They were just maybe a bit dirty, like you'd expect active kids to be, and so it comforted Dr. Goldberger to see some signs of normalcy here. After dinner, the doctor stayed up for a while organizing his research. He was beginning to see strange patterns in who got pellagra and who didn't. At the sanitarium in Georgia, pellagra had struck people from every age group, from grandparents to young kids. But here, at this orphanage, all the pellagra patients were the same age group, between 6 and 12. This was new. He'd never encountered a disease before that only affected people of certain ages. Dr. Goldberger now felt confident pellagra was not spread by black flies, but he had a new riddle to solve. Why would infants and older kids not get pellagra while the kids in the middle of those two groups were getting so sick? Dr. Goldberger laid in bed, thinking in circles and listening to the drone of cicadas outside. But he couldn't sleep. He just couldn't get those faces of the kids in the sick ward out of his mind. The next morning, Dr. Goldberger woke up early, gathered his notes, and called a meeting with the matron. He wanted to know every detail of how the kids at the orphanage were cared for, from daily activities to sleeping arrangements to meals. The matron explained that they tried to make the kids' lives as normal as possible, but it had grown more difficult in recent years because of cutbacks to the orphanage's funding. The staff had been forced to ration the more expensive foods. For instance, now only the youngest kids were given milk because it was essential to their growth, while all the other kids went without it. The staff had also begun assigning chores to the older kids. The orphanage needed constant repairs, but because of these cutbacks, they could no longer afford to hire outside help. And so in exchange for their labor, the older kids were given bigger and better meals, including meat and vegetables, at least once a week. By comparison, the kids in the middle, between ages 6 and 12, ate mostly cornmeal with molasses. On rare occasions, they got whatever low-quality meat the orphanage could scrounge up. They got almost no milk or vegetables at all. Dr. Goldberger was stunned. The kids in the 6 to 12 group were not getting enough to eat, and they were overwhelmingly the ones getting pellagra. Of course, he knew that a bad diet could lead to health complications, but it didn't make sense that it would cause something as horrible as pellagra. The doctor then asked the matron if there were any kids in the 6 to 12-year-old age range who showed no signs of pellagra. Unfortunately, almost all of the kids in that middle age group had at least some symptoms of pellagra. But then she smiled and said actually there were a few kids in that age group who were totally healthy. They were 3 troublemaking 12-year-olds named Charlie, Henry, and Frank. That was not what Dr. Goldberger wanted to hear. If some of the kids eating this terrible diet were not getting the disease, then food had nothing to do with who got sick. The matron led the doctor outside to a courtyard where the 3 troublemaking boys were running around playing tag. None of them looked sick at all, even though they lived in a facility full of kids their age ravaged by disease. So what made these 3 special? Dr. Goldberger walked up to the 3 kids and asked how they'd been feeling lately. The boys looked at each other, confused by the question, then shrugged and ran off to continue their game. The doctor smiled. Disinterest was a normal reaction for happy, distracted kids. They clearly were not worried about their health. So the doctor thanked the matron and then headed back to his room, wondering if Charlie, Henry, and Frank held some secret to avoiding pellagra. And if they did, he desperately needed to know what it was. Dr. Goldberger stayed up late that night trying to solve the riddle of the 3 healthy boys. He combed through all the existing research on pellagra, searching for an answer for why they were not getting sick. He got so lost in thought that when he finally looked up, it was almost midnight. He decided a little breath of cool night air might help him sleep easier, so he got up and left the room. But just as he closed the door and stepped into the hallway, Dr. Goldberger heard hushed voices. In the otherwise silent orphanage, the sound echoed. He held his breath and listened. There they were again, whispers and then footsteps. The doctor tiptoed towards where the noise was coming from, and he peered around the corner just in time to see the doors to the cafeteria's kitchen swinging shut. The doctor crept along the hallway to the cafeteria entrance, and when he got there, he put his ear up to the door, and he could hear inside the cafeteria cupboards opening and excited voices muttering. The doctor peeked through the gap between the double doors, and he stifled a laugh. The 3 boys from earlier, Charlie, Henry, and Frank, were raiding the pantry. Dr. Goldberger was tempted to leave them be, but he realized that whatever they were eating might explain why they had not caught Pellagra. So he slipped into the kitchen and cleared his throat. The boys instantly spun around, embarrassed looks all over their faces. They'd been caught red-handed, and there was no hiding it. But Dr. Goldberger immediately assured them that they were not in trouble. In fact, he said, they could actually be a big help to him. All he needed to know was what they were eating. If they told him, he'd go back to his room, and this could be their little secret. The boys exchanged confused glances, and then nodded to each other. They went to the pantry and pulled out the food they'd been stealing. A few peaches, a handful of peanuts, and some leftover chicken. Dr. Goldberger smiled, and then, in a conspiratorial whisper, asked them if they'd done this before. The boys' faces went red, and they looked down at their feet, and then one of them quietly admitted that yes, they had. Dr. Goldberger felt a surge of excitement. He thanked the boys for their honesty, then left them to their midnight snack. As the doctor headed back to his room, his mind spun with activity. He knew he was close to a breakthrough. By morning, he had devised a plan to test his theory. If it worked, he could finally solve the mystery of what was causing Pellagra, and he could save countless lives. But Dr. Goldberger's experiment would take a little patience and more than a little danger for the people who actually took part in it. 8 months later, in February of 1915, on a pleasantly cool Mississippi morning, Dr. Goldberger stood outside of a brick building that looked just like a castle, complete with turrets and battlements. This would be his new home for the next 6 months, and where his grand experiment would take place, Rankin State Prison Farm. He needed a controlled environment for his test to be scientific, and this place was as controlled as it got. To date, there had been 0 cases of Pellagra at this prison. But if the doctor's theory was correct, that would not be the case for much longer. Dr. Goldberger regretted what he was about to do. Pellagra killed about 1 out of every 30 people, and if he wasn't careful, his experiment could cost lives. But he didn't feel like he had a choice. People were counting on him. Already, dozens of his patients at the sanitarium and orphanage had died, and the Pellagra outbreaks at those locations were not showing any signs of slowing down. So Dr. Goldberger went inside, and the warden then led him to the setting for his experiment, a prison within the prison. It was a private, newly built barracks with barred cells, a cafeteria, and a small screened-in yard. Throughout the experiment, the inmates here would have no contact with the rest of the prison population, so there could be no contamination. In exchange for agreeing to be a human guinea pig for 6 months, the 11 prisoners in the experiment would be given full pardons, $5, and a new suit. The warden then gave his sign to his staff, and the prisoners were brought in. 11 hardened men in pinstripe jumpsuits. Dr. Goldberger watched them file in for breakfast, taking a plate of food from the cafeteria workers and then settling in at a long table. Everyone was tense and alert, like nobody knew what to expect. But once they began eating, the mood turned festive. They cleared their plates, went for seconds, and cracked jokes about how lucky they were. This was a vacation compared to what they were used to. But Dr. Goldberger knew that if his experiment worked, the next 6 months would be anything but relaxing. Because if his suspicions were correct, then these men would contract Pellagra and all the horrible suffering that came with it. Almost 6 months later, Dr. Goldberger woke early in his room at the prison and pulled out his calendar. It was the 2nd week of September. The experiment's deadline was approaching fast, and he wasn't getting the results he had hoped for. In 6 weeks, all the funding for this would end, the barracks would be dismantled, and the prisoners would walk free. But there really was nothing Dr. Goldberger could do to make things move faster. The experiment had to move at its own pace. A few inmates had complained of some new ailments, headaches, backaches, dizziness, nausea, but they were nothing that could be pinpointed as Pellagra. Just then, a guard knocked on the door and said there'd been an incident with one of the prisoners, who was now restrained in his cell and demanding to talk to the doctor. Dr. Goldberger followed the guard to the prisoner's cell, and as soon as the inmate caught sight of the doctor, the inmate began yelling. He called Dr. Goldberger a crook and shouted that he'd rather just serve his entire sentence back inside the regular prison than stay another second in this hell. Dr. Goldberger was not surprised. The joyful mood from the beginning of this experiment had totally worn off. Many of the inmates were grouchy and irritable, and he was getting yelled at a lot. Dr. Goldberger watched the prisoner thrash against his restraints and howl, when suddenly the doctor caught a glimpse of something through a tear in the prisoner's shoulder seam. The doctor called for the guards to come open up the cell, and then once they had, Dr. Goldberger rushed in and stretched that rip in the prisoner's shoulder even wider, and when he did, boom, there it was. A scaly rash stretching along the prisoner's shoulder blades and up around the base of his neck. Dr. Goldberger then pulled up the prisoner's shirt, and the man's torso was a trail of blackened rashes and pimply sores. There was no doubt this man had pellagra, and he didn't catch it from another prisoner or from the guards. This man must have gotten pellagra from Dr. Goldberger's experiment. Dr. Goldberger asked the guards to please send all the other inmates back to their cells. The doctor wanted to do a full-body checkup on each of them. Once all the prisoners were ready, Dr. Goldberger slowly walked along the cell block, scanning each prisoner from head to toe, and as he did, his pen was a blur in his notebook, furiously scribbling detailed descriptions. The doctor couldn't believe what he was seeing. His hands were shaking. 5 more men had clear symptoms of pellagra, meaning 6 out of the 11 volunteers had caught the deadly disease. Dr. Goldberger dashed back to his office and quickly sent word to the governor. His experiment had worked. Now it was time to tell the world.
Every dusk would weather the storm. In the echo of our footsteps trace our moments captured in this place. Windowsill and midnight breeze, caught in the branches of the trees. Every breath we took remains in the hush of memory's veins. Memory lane, where dreams align. Every stone has a tale so fine. Our love engraved in every street. Here's where the past and present meet.
What Dr. Goldberger had discovered was shockingly simple. Pellagra was not caused by black flies transmitting a virus or bacteria, and pellagra was not contagious. Pellagra was caused by food. Specifically, it was caused by the traditional American Southern diet in poor households: salt pork, molasses, and cornmeal. If that was all somebody ate, it was highly likely they would get pellagra. And people who supplemented this traditional Southern diet with things like milk and vegetables and fresh meat would not get pellagra. Once these results were published, there were mixed reactions from the scientific community. Some wanted to nominate Dr. Goldberger for a Nobel Prize, but just as many doubted the experiment's results, in particular doctors and officials who lived in the American South. They felt like this northern doctor was criticizing their entire way of life. Dr. Goldberger was frustrated that people were questioning his discovery. After all, he had proven it with the experiment he ran at the prison. The prisoners who had volunteered to be a part of it had followed a strict diet of biscuits, gravy, cornbread, grits, rice, syrup, collard greens, and yams. They could eat as much of these foods as they wanted, but no other types of food. And this diet is what caused half of the prisoners to develop pellagra, just like the residents of the Georgia State Sanitarium for the Insane and the children between the ages of 6 and 12 at the orphanage. They all got pellagra from their diet. Still, while Dr. Goldberger had proven that a better, more varied diet was enough to prevent pellagra, he had not actually figured out why that was. It would take another 20 years until scientists actually proved what caused pellagra. It is caused from a deficiency of vitamin B3, also known as niacin. The traditional post-Civil War Southern diet of dried meat, molasses, and cornmeal severely lacked this nutrient, which is why the region was hit so much harder than other areas in America. But once people started adding niacin back into their diet, mostly in the form of enriched flour, the disease no longer manifested, and almost everyone already suffering from it recovered. All told, over 100,000 people died of pellagra between 1900 and 1940 until it disappeared with the identification of niacin. Sadly, Dr. Goldberger died before this discovery of an unrelated and extremely rare form of cancer. However, Dr. Goldberger will always be remembered because he was the one who cracked the riddle of pellagra and saved tens of thousands of lives. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story, and also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Britt Brown. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Ryan Potesta. Coordinating producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Teja Palakonda. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballen Studios, our head of production is Zach Levitt. Script editing is by Scott Allen and Evan Allen. Our coordinating producer is Matub Zaire. Executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballen, and Nick Witters. For Wondery, our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Senior producers are Loredana Palavoda and Dave Schilling. Senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr. Our executive producers are Aaron O'Flaherty and Marshall Louie for Wondery.